Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Writer podcast. And just let me say, this is episode number 15, and I'm really excited about that. So, this is the podcast where we talk about writing and publishing, and most of all, the mindset you need to flourish as author in the 21st century. My name is Hannah Steenbock. I'm a German author and coach, and with me in the podcast is
I'm Diane Patterson. I'm a novelist and blogger.
And
yeah,
today,
15. I have to check every week when I'm setting it up going, wait, what number is this? Yes. And our topic this week is
genre.
Which, how could we spend an entire hour talking about such a narrow topic? Yes.
We can do several episodes on genre, especially if you start digging down into diverse ones, because we're at least writing in probably 3 or 4 different genres ourselves.
Yes.
And I'm sure we could find experts for others.
Well, it's interesting when you mentioned this as a topic, I found myself saying, well, what is there to say about genre? And then, of course, what isn't there to say about genre? So we could start at the top level. But first, we're not going to start with that. We're going to hold off on that. We're going to start with the week that's gone by. So, Hannah, how did this week go for you in writing, publishing,
It was a fascinating week because I kept writing in that new genre that I began writing in, and I'm still having fun. I'm still discovering the rules. I definitely will have to do research because, as we'll see today, each genre has rules. Some have more than others. Mm-hmm. And the one that I'm finding my way into, actually it's a border between 2 genres, which doesn't really make it easier. But I'm really trying to figure out if I'm doing it right, if my stories actually fit, if they fit the expectations of the reader, if they fit the stereotypes, because each genre does have a stereotype or several. So it's been an exciting week, both with writing and research, and I'm happy with it.
Oh, great.
How about you?
This week was great writing-wise. I wrote about 12 or 13,000 words.
Wow.
So far. And yeah, given it's a holiday weekend here, and basically we approach holiday weekends by everyone flopping in their own little area and going, I can't deal with this heat. So I may actually just continue to write today and finish the week with even more. But yeah, 12 to 13,000 words. It's been going really well.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Certainly better than past weeks have been. The other thing, the other news, which doesn't affect me, but all of this stuff affects us because we are indie publishers, was Amazon released some more information about the new Kindle Unlimited program.
Oh, and much flailing ensued.
Well, I don't want to be all conspiracy theorist on you, but Amazon knows perfectly well that they're going to get flailing when they release numbers like this. What Amazon released were the numbers for the month of June, the size of the pot of Kindle Unlimited money, and the number of pages read. Now, Kindle Unlimited is moving to a get paid per page read model. So they released these numbers for the month of June. And if you do the simple division, number of pages, amount of money, it came out to 0.5 cents per page.
Which is even worse than most people expected.
I was thinking it was going to be a penny per page. A lot of people were thinking 3 cents, 0.5 cents per page.
Which is painful.
Which is painful for a lot of people. A lot of people have seen their incomes go down by 50 to 75% overnight. And here's the thing. Amazon hasn't said that this is going to be the rate. All they said was, here were the numbers for June, which, by the way, is a notoriously slow month for reading. So in an active month for reading, such as November or December, that number of pages is going to be much bigger. So it would go down to what, 1/4 cent per page?
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Amazon is a giant corporation run by smart people. They know perfectly well how much they're going to pay.
Yes.
They're not going to tell anybody what that rate is until August 15th. So they've changed the program starting July 1st, and they're telling people the rate on August 15th, saying, you know, you just want to hang out in Kindle Unlimited and we'll tell you at what rate you're earning 6 weeks from now. They know now, by the way. This is they're not going to, it's not going to be August 13th and they're all going to sit around going, I don't know, what should we pay them? It's not how it's going to work.
Yes.
So there is a lot now. There are some novelists. So some, you know, because writers, despite having the stereotype of being afraid of money, afraid of numbers, there are quite a few writers who are very good with numbers, and they sat down and crunched out what the sweet spot is for length of book in this new system. And there are some novelists who are going to do very well.
Yes.
At 1/2 cent per page. Their incomes will go up. There's one writer, a very prolific writer, who estimates so far that she will make $15,000 more in July than she did in June under this system.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a pretty good month. They aren't saying. And so, you know, a lot of writers who have, now you can say, well, you shouldn't go all in with Amazon or whatever. You know what? There are ways of running your business, and you have to run it the best way you can. And
Yes.
Amazon has just pulled out the rug and said, we're not telling you any numbers for 6 weeks. Do with that what you will. It's a tough time. It's a really tough time.
There is other news which has sort of disappeared, but Amazon Kindle Unlimited isn't the only subscription service. In fact, they created it to compete with other subscription services like Scribd and Oyster. And Scribd did something horrendous last week. Scribd pulled 80 to 90% of all romance and erotica novels without telling the authors beforehand, which means pulling the rug out from under them with no notice whatsoever, because they were losing money on that genre. We're back to genre. And seriously, I have one book in Scribd, which is not romance. I think I have sold one copy. So it's not really affecting me, but I thought that was even worse. That news has not really resonated a lot through the writing world. But imagine that you have a distributor that pulls your book without notice because their business model isn't working out, and you have to know they're still not making any money with that.
Well, Scribd problem, or Scribd, I don't actually know. Is it Scribd or Scribd? The problem that they're having is the same problem that led Amazon to rework Kindle Unlimited, which is that romance and erotica readers are voracious. Even with romance novels, there are people who will read a romance novel per day.
Yes.
If you're reading 1 unit per day, under the old Kindle Unlimited model, you pay $10 a month to belong, and each unit borrowed paid if you read 10%, paid the author $1.35, which comes out to what, 8 units per month? She said, not having done the math ahead of talking.
Probably sort of like
something like that. Well, if you're a voracious romance reader, you're easily reading 20 to 30 books per month. And if you're a voracious short story reader, you're reading a whole heck of a lot more than that.
Yeah.
So the only way that these subscription models work is if people don't use them,
Yes.
particularly with voracious readers like romance and erotica readers.
Which
Now,
is a
people say,
problem.
you know, the other subscription thing that came out this week was Apple's new music subscription service.
Yes.
And everyone's like, well, they're managing to make it work for $15 a month. And it's like, even though they have to pay the songwriters every single time they play the song, it's like, it's different. They're not paying the songwriters nearly as much per song as people were making per book, because we assume we're going to listen to songs over and over and over again. You assume that someone reads a book once, that someone watches a movie once. Yes, which is mostly true. This is why stuff goes in and out of Netflix all the time, because people have watched it, they're not going to watch it again, and the production company or the studio only gets paid for that thing once. Books and movies are a different unit than music, and you can't compare them.
But still, Apple isn't paying a lot for the songs, and I think, was it Taylor Swift who complained, and
now they're getting paid for the introductory.
Yeah. So subscription services generally have a problem. They only work if people do not really use them as much as they pay for them. So they basically live on the people who subscribe and forget about them. Mm-hmm. So it's not a really sustainable model unless they don't pay for the creators of the content. I mean, if you get just mere cents for the content, then it works. Or you need to have subscribers who don't use it, and that's kind of silly. I don't think it's a realistic business model, and we'll see how far that goes with books. I could actually see that going away eventually.
This Kindle Unlimited for Amazon. I mean, one of the problems with Scrib's model is that they were paying based on the cover price of the book. They were paying some percentage of the cover price.
I think they were paying 70% or something. It was pretty. It's a lot, actually.
Whereas Amazon had said, we will pay you this per borrow.
Exactly. Amazon has turned it around, and they're basically using their subscription money to pay those participating in it, which works as long as those participating in it are willing to be paid less than for a sale. Yeah. So as authors, we're paying for the exposure by earning less.
Funny how many places variations this week I've read on, well, Amazon just needs to fix this to pay us more. And I'm going, you guys don't understand. You are, yes, Amazon has created this great storefront for books. They're not doing that because they love you. This is not about you.
This is business.
They will change Kindle Unlimited to keep buyers happy. You don't want to hang out in it? Sayonara.
And that's a brilliant thing. We can actually move out. If we don't like it, we don't have to do it. And we can still sell our books on Amazon. It's just you opt out of Kindle Select, and that's okay. And
there is no Taylor Swift for this business, though.
No, there isn't. There isn't really, and it's business between content providers, the distributor, and the content users, and all three of them have to be in a balance. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what Amazon is doing. They're trying to find a balance. Because if they don't treat authors, if they treat authors too badly and everyone pulls their books, the readers won't be happy, obviously. So they will have to find a balance to make it interesting for authors to be there. They have to make it interesting for the readers to be there, and they have to, cover the cost mostly. I mean, they still don't really earn a whole lot because they put a lot of money
Amazon
back
doesn't earn a profit because Amazon is deliberately not earning a profit.
Yes, I agree. They're using the money for something else.
Well, yeah, they have organized their entire business model to avoid making profits. I mean, this is a distinct business decision that they have made.
Yes, yes. They're making enough to stay afloat. They're not in the red, but but they're also not making
They change their expenses based on how much they make.
Yes, which is a fascinating business model on its own. But yeah, this week has seen a lot of disturbance in the writing system and among indie authors. A lot of flailing, a lot of desperation for some, which I feel. I mean, I feel sorry for them. That's been a business model that worked for a year, and now it's gone. And yeah, people will need to have to adapt. That's life. I mean, and I'm kind of grateful that I don't have to adapt a whole lot, because I've never gotten to the point where I depended on one distributor and one business section of it. So.
Okay, so let's get to this week's topic, which has been much on Hannah's mind. I guess it's been somewhat on my mind too, because of my crazy side project this year. But you can lead up to. You can tell us some about your previous preferred genre and the genre you're working in and why you're thinking about this.
Well, I was firmly a speculative fiction writer. I used to do fantasy, and I'm still doing fantasy. I'm not leaving that genre. I love reading fantasy and science fiction, and I've done a couple of short stories in science fiction, which is a little harder for me to write than fantasy, because it takes a lot more research to do science fiction well. I really think you need to have a realistic feel to the technology in science fiction. But they're usually logged together in one big genre that can overlap. And what I love about fantasy, and I was reading around yesterday, and I read an interview with an author whose name I promptly forgot. But I agree with what he said. He said fantasy is a genre with very little boundaries, with very little restrictions, and very little must-haves, except possibly magic. You need some kind of magic in fantasy to make it fantasy, or you need at least some magical beasts or some paranormal stuff. You need something that is not in this world. And it could be dragons, it could be wizards, it could be demons, whatever. But you need something out of this world to make it fantasy, even if it takes place in this world. But even urban fantasy has, I don't know, vampires. But you need something that is different from this world to make it fantasy. And I personally love it because you can take everyday experiences, and you can take everyday challenges and transform them into another world. Take them into another world. Transform them into challenges like killing the dragon. I mean, I hate killing dragons, but anyway, let's imagine killing the dragon. And it could be a metaphor for killing your fears and for overcoming your fears. And people won't necessarily realize, and they'll be entertained by it, and they'll also, on a subconscious level, will learn to enjoy the story, or learn something about their own way of dealing with fears. And I kind of love doing this kind of subtle stuff and using fantasy to transport that kind of topic and theme.
Do you think about metaphor before writing?
Not a whole lot, but it turns out I usually have that in my stuff, and I'm always kind of surprised when a reader points it out, saying, "Well, okay, if you want to see that in there, yes, I suppose it's in there." Yeah.
Some of this stuff is hard to get away from. There's a reason that we keep learning about it in high school English classes.
Yeah, yeah, you can overinterpret things, obviously, but I mean, that is it. The thing about fantasy is, and that's what I use in coaching, it is a technique to put some distance between yourself and what's happening. And in some cases, that distance makes it safe. In therapy, we call it dissociation. And it's being used on purpose sometimes to look at events that are so scary and so terrifying that you can't deal with it unless you find a method of dissociation. I'm not saying I'm doing that in fantasy, but it is a technique to have a bit of a distance between yourself and what you're experiencing in the story and in the book. And I'm not sure if all genres can do that. Fantasy definitely does it by taking you to a different world. You're always aware it's a different world. In fact, that's another thing in fantasy that keeps reminding you that it's a different world. Well, even if it's urban fantasy here.
And every genre has stuff like that. Like murder mysteries tend to be about good versus evil and secrets. Yeah. What science fiction is about what happens if we continue on such and such technological path. Right, not always, but these are the generalizations, folks.
Romance is about love.
What is it like about, you know, merging with another human being, emotionally as well as every other way? What does that mean for your life? So these genres cover entire metaphors in and of themselves. The Westerns, the good guys versus the bad guys. And of course, it's always interesting when you can flip a genre on on its head, and the good guys become the bad guys, and vice versa. And now genre. What is the other really great thing about genre? Is that it tells you where in the bookstore to find the book you're looking for.
Yeah.
It's very, very handy. It's like I'm looking for a book by Jim Butcher. I go to the science fiction fantasy section. Done. It's, it gets harder. I went into Barnes and Noble the other day. Haven't been in an actual bookstore in a long time. And I kept walking down the fiction aisles and I kept recognizing all of these mystery authors. Now, they also had a mystery section. And I'm like, wait, why are these mystery authors here and not in mystery? We don't know how bookstores are arranged anymore.
But it's even better if you don't know an author name and you're going to find something else that you like to read. You can go to the genre shelf, either offline or online, and you can look into that, and you'll know in science fiction you get technology and future stuff and whatever, spaceships. And in fantasy you'll get possibly dragons and mages, and in romance you'll get the happy ever after, which is a must-have in the romance genre. And in mystery you'll get the murder stories. And you can already go in there with a certain expectation, and then you can look at the covers and the descriptions and everything and see if it's your kind or not. But it is a first step to narrow down the selection, and we're always overwhelmed by too much choice, so we need to narrow down our selection.
Now, you do get interesting genre mashups like Outlander, which is your general time travel, historical fiction, romance.
Oh, okay. I was thinking of something.
Oh, yeah, with Diana Gabaldon, where the chick goes from 1940s Britain back to Scotland. A lot of people had no idea where to slot that one when it came out. So that, and there are some great things about genre, which is there are conventions in the way it's described and the way it's packaged. So you pick up a book, you look at the cover, you're like, that's military science fiction, a subgenre of science fiction. I want to read that, or I don't want to read that. Boom, back on the shelf. This has a dragon on the cover. I like dragons, or I'm looking for one with a wizard. Back on the shelf. And every genre has convention. Now, every story starts out, as we discussed in an earlier episode, every story basically has the same structure.
Yes.
You have a problem. The main character is forced to deal with this problem. That's the end of Act 1. They are committed to deal with this problem. Act 2, they attack various ways of dealing with this problem, either trying to run away or various methods that don't work. The end of Act 2, there's one path open to them. Act 3, they deal with the problem. In romance, this is, no, I don't want to be in love with you. Act 2, we're going to be falling in love. Murder mystery, I have to find out who killed this person. Act 2, go about various ways of trying to find this person. Yes. Westerns. The sheep ranchers are refusing to deal with the cattle ranchers. Chaos ensues. In each genre, though, there are specific things that must happen. Yes. So,
I may say with the exception of fantasy, but I mean, aside from having the basic structure, which you can always find everywhere.
Well, I would think that with 80 or 90% of fantasy seems to be young person going on a quest of some sort.
Yeah, I kind of, a lot of people are done with that, but
I can imagine, because it's been done so many times. I mean, there's the Ur epic fantasy of the Lord of the Rings, and then it seemed like there were tens of thousands of homages to that.
Clones, if you want to be nasty.
No, we're going to say homages because we're going to respect our fellow authors. But this is generally the storyline. They discover that they have some mission to do. They discover that they're the chosen one in some way. What are some other? They apprentice to some magician.
Yeah, but I'm serious. This is part of the story structure. You don't have to have the apprentice thing, but you have a story structure where a hero tends to learn new stuff anyway to deal with the problem, because they wouldn't have the problem if they could deal with it in Act 1. Oh, yeah. So they'll need to grow, and you'll have that in every genre. And let me just think about fantasy. Like one book that really, and I would have to unplug everything to get the visual cue, but Libriomancer by Jim C. Hines is about a guy who can reach into books and pull out things. So he has magic, which makes it fantasy. Mm-hmm. He doesn't apprentice. He has a problem that he has been forbidden to use his magic, and he finds himself in a situation where he does have to, and he rebels against the rules that have been imposed on him, and he gets hurt for it. But in the end, he saves the day. But he doesn't have to go into an apprentice system. He sort of gets pulled into the trouble, and he uses his abilities, and he learns a lot more about his abilities, and he makes friends who help him. So you have the usual structure. You have this hero being confronted with a problem that's much bigger than he can handle by himself. You have the Act 2 where he collects his allies and sort of discovers more about the problem. And then you have Act 3 where he gets almost killed several times and barely makes it out alive, but he saves the day anyway, which is a typical story structure. But you don't have the apprentice thing, you don't have the young lost person, and it's still firmly fantasy because you have the magic, you have vampires and werewolves, you have spells and whatnot. So I think that's an awesome example of how the genre has come along and how it has evolved from the classic Lord
Well,
of the
that's
Rings begins.
interesting that you use that word, evolve. I'm willing to bet that Jim C. Hines, I've never read anything by him other than some of his blog posts, so I'm not that familiar with his work. But I'm willing to bet he has written a ton of stuff and he has read a ton of stuff in the fantasy genre.
Absolutely. Yes.
That he knew.
And he has written some very classic fantasy stuff too.
Okay. Yeah, that he knew when he decided to drop some elements of fantasy, he did it knowingly and
Oh,
for
yes.
some purpose. And that only comes by being fully grounded in the genre.
Yes, I agree. That is, if you decide to be a genre writer, and that's what I meant with research when I talked about discovering or entering a new genre early on, you really need to read in the genre. You need to familiarize with yourself with it. You need to understand the conventions, because every genre has many or less or fewer conventions, but they are there. And if you break them, well, it's the same with all the rules. You have to know them before you can break them.
Yeah.
You have to know what you're doing.
There's a great quote from Neil Gaiman when a well-known British literary author announced that she was going to write a science fiction book. Gaiman received this announcement with said normally what this means, or what it meant back when I was a book reviewer in the early 80s, is that the author has an SF idea, has read no SF, so doesn't know that the idea was explored pretty thoroughly in 1953, and then plonks the idea down on the page rather dully while doing interviews in which the author denies that the book is SF. And yeah. And I know that, I guess, Kazuo Ishikawa, and please don't send me hate mail if I just completely destroyed his name, who did, I think, Remains of the Day, just came out with a book with dragons.
One dragon, I forgot what it was called. It was post-apocalyptic something, and it had a dragon in it, and he said it wasn't.
That this is not fantasy.
Yeah, and there was quite a huge discussion about that, and people got upset, and turns out the dragon doesn't do a lot of dragonish things anyway, so maybe
it's this genre is considered slumming it, or a dirty word by litfic authors, because it's so formulaic. No, I wish.
I think it's the discussion that here in Germany they call it entertaining literature or literature for its own sake. So,
and the lovely thing is that's all one word, folks.
Yes, and here most people who study German literature kind of look down on anything that's meant to entertain, which in turn means that true literature does not entertain, which kind of makes it hard to read. So if you say you're a genre author and you want to have a presentation at a literary house, you'd better either sell tons or be famous for something, because they will simply not accept you as an author. I've had the fun of doing that. I was reading a massively fantasy story where I had replaced all the technology with magic. It was a really fun, I love it, it's a fun story. I still adore my main character in it, who is a spell repair person. He repairs old spells, the magic mender. And so I was reading the story and people enjoyed it, and then someone from the audience asked me the question, why would I write science fiction? And I was like, science fiction? Didn't you kind of notice the magic in here? So this was a person who was completely innocent of any genre knowledge.
And well, that's the thing, though. If it's generally pretty easy to learn the conventions of a genre, You have to put in the effort to read it, though.
Yes, it takes time, at least that.
And this is one thing, for instance, I've mentioned this in a previous episode. I'm on an erotica writers board. And, you know, people always say, I've written 12 stories, but I'm not getting any kind of the sales that the rest of you are. And they say, how much in your particular subgenre have you read? And they'll say, nothing.
Yeah.
You got to read it. I don't read or write erotica. I mean, I don't write erotica. I don't read it. I wouldn't presume to write it without reading it.
Yeah.
You know, I have read my share of science fiction and fantasy over the years. I feel like I would have to do a lot of research in what's being published now before even sitting down to think I could do that. It's kind of weird that people think, oh, I can do this without reading it.
I think fantasy is most forgiving because it's such an open genre, and you can really experiment a lot in it, as compared to, let's say, erotica, which is pretty formulaic, and romance, which is also quite. I've been reading some romance because I'm in an author group where people write romance, and they ask me for feedback, and of course I like to read what they're doing just to understand them. And I'm beginning to see the steps in romance, because that is, you really have the first meeting, you have the falling in love, you have the denial of love, then you have the moment when they accept that they're in love, you have the first sex scene, then you have the catastrophe where something happens that drives them completely apart, that completely breaks up any chance, any hope. You know, that's the second, third act thing. And then you have the revelation that brings them back together, and you have the happy ever after in the last 5 pages. So that is a very, and all romance writers out there, please forgive me if I got anything wrong, I missed something.
I was going to say, I've read a few romances where there was a sex scene in the first 10 pages. I mean, but I'm going to be willing to bet that whoever wrote that book had written a whole bunch of romance before that and was aware.
You can have that. You can have that. It could be part of the falling in love thing in the first act. And it doesn't have to be, but it could be. So, yeah, major sex scenes are happening at certain points in the story. And you can have
used to be when I was a kid, when I was in high school, the mother of a friend of mine wanted to make some extra money easily, by writing some romance novels really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And she actually managed to sell a couple. But at that time, there were books that people were selling, and maybe they're still selling them, I don't know, saying, okay, on page 53, this is where this, the whole save the cat, on page 53, this is where this has to happen. And she would follow these instructions to the letter, like really formulaic, because she didn't read them, but she did want to write them.
But I mean, I've read, I don't know, 10, 12 romances. Thinking back, I must have read some more earlier. But the last few that I've seen, and they're enjoyable books. They're lovely books. They have, I'm reading some where there's a whole lot of background. They're written by a smart person. You can tell she has researched a lot of the surrounding parts, like one of the main characters is a person who lost a leg in the war. So she researched that and how it works to live with prosthetics, and you can tell she put a lot of thought into that and a lot of background, and I really enjoyed that. But she still has that formula: first meeting, interest, and then falling in love, then the big catastrophe. I have a feeling that's the major plot point you have to hit in a romance. And the other big thing that you can't go without is the happy ever after ending, because if you don't have that, it's not a romance.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So So that's literary or dark fiction or something. But if you don't have the making up,
Right.
the coming together as a couple,
Yes,
it's not
romance readers will not accept. Which is part of the reason why, by the way, romance is so denigrated, because there is a built-in happy ending.
And I think that's okay, because part of the work genre does for you is telling you if you are going to like the book. And personally, I like happy endings. I will have happy endings in my fantasy stories, which does not take them out of the genre. Fortunately, fantasy is allowed to have happy endings, but they're not a must-have in that genre.
And genres change too.
Yes.
Like, for instance, it used to be like in the mystery genre, there was, you know, the police were always fighting on the right side. They were always going after the really evil criminal. They would find all the clues and they would catch their man, and order was returned to the world. Well, of course, over the past couple of decades, this has changed dramatically. Even if you have the cop who's out there doing the right thing, he's probably not going to be a shining beacon of humanity, because readers aren't going to buy that anymore. They can see the daily newspaper. It's more shades of gray, shall we say.
Well, you won't get the Hercule Poirot kind of people. You will still get them, but I think most readers prefer some heroes that are less perfect nowadays, and they like to have, like you said, some shades of gray.
So there are materials out there to help you with genre. After you have done your required 10,000 or 100,000 pages of reading, because you should know what's going on out there.
Yeah, 100,000 is more like it, really.
Yeah, I know. One is a book, and I actually haven't looked at this recently. This was a book I got a million years ago. It's called How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy by, yes, Orson Scott Card. And there were, in our great book purges, I continually thought about getting rid of this book, but I ended up keeping it because it's a really useful, good book on writing, in which he talks about the elements of science fiction and fantasy and what you need to think about when creating your worlds.
Oh, yes.
If you're going to create a system of magic, what does it work on, and what is the cost for using it?
Yes.
You really have to sit down and work that all out ahead of time, because if it's just, I think you don't.
I think it's important to have a cost for magic, but you don't have to have like a full Dungeons and Dragons system of spells worked out. If you do, it shows. I've seen books that have been based that have, they didn't say, but they were based on Dungeons and Dragons spell systems. And if you've done a bit of role playing along those lines, those books get very predictable, very boring. So I think take that with a grain of salt. Do think about the magic and the level of magic you want to have, and do think about the cost of it. Because if people just, shoot magic out of their fingertips, you don't have a challenge for the hero either. So it all fits in with basic storytelling. You have to have challenges, and you have to have obstacles to overcome. And if you have a mage who can just snap his fingers and make everything nice and happy, then where's the story? But yes, I'm not a firm believer in creating full worked out magic systems, but it does have to have some logic to it, like limits and cost. And and you can't see it, but on the top of the shelf behind me there's a second and third edition of Dungeons and Dragons, so I've played with that. And I'm actually friends with a lot of role-playing people who are still creating world after world after world, and some are trying to write stories in their world, and they end up describing their system and not telling a story. So don't get too lost in creating the world. Keep your story first.
Yeah. So there's a good book, and I will have a link to this in the show notes.
Yes.
That I like very much, called The Story Grid by Sean Coyne. And you can find most of the bits of this book at storygrid.com or thestorygrid.com, and I'll have that too. But I like having the book on hand too. And one of the big analysis that he does in the book is of Silence of the Lambs, down to a scene by scene level, like what's happening in this scene, how it flips to the next scene, etc., and how you can use this technique to analyze your own work after you've written it. But one of the things he does in it is he has a whole chapter about the obligatory scenes and conventions of the thriller. And obligatory scenes is a really interesting concept. So in this, he said that having looked at, hundreds of thrillers, which are the main blockbuster genre these days, he says, there must be a crime with a perpetrator and a victim. The crime must occur early on in the telling. The crime must reveal a clue about the villain's MacGuffin, whatever the villain thinks he's after. There must be a brilliant or incredibly powerful master criminal and an equally brilliant or powerful investigator, detective, sleuth. The villain must make it personal with regard to the protagonist. And he, somewhere in here, and he says that there's a speech in praise of the villain in the book. And I was thinking about that going, yeah, I guess in a lot of books I can think of that there is that scene. The stakes must become personal, et cetera, et cetera. And if you read a lot of thrillers, you sort of take this in. Of course, I would need this to make it feel like it belongs in the genre. You can change it, obviously, but boy, you really better know what you're doing if you do. If you drop the big confrontation between the protagonist and the villain, boy, howdy, are your readers going to say, what? I remember reading a friend's screenplay where it was a very charming little screenplay about, a scrappy band of underdogs against the well-funded corporate overlords. And I got to the end and I said, you never have a scene where they confront one another? She said, oh, really? I said, yeah, you really need that scene. I kind of all the air just sort of went out at the end. You need the big climax. So a book like Coyne's is really good for reminding you of keeping you on track and making sure you have these scenes. So like I used to, many years ago, a friend got me into Regency romances. I had never read romances up until this point. I then read about 80 Regency romances until I completely burned out and then didn't read anymore. But boy, howdy, did I get used to the obligatory scenes in that book. You had the cotillion at, there was a dance place where everyone always went to. You had, the fitting for dresses scene. You had the, everybody waiting in their carriage scene. Every single one of these books had hit one of these scenes. Absolutely.
It's like Jane Austen all over again.
Yeah, well, actually, it's funny because everyone says Jane Austen, but where she is the Ur writer, I would say the actual creator of the Regency romance is Georgette Heyer.
Yeah.
Who wrote 100 of these books.
Yeah, I haven't read her, so Jane Austen came to mind.
Yeah. No, a lot of these archetypal scenes are from Georgette Heyer.
And I think that is
Almax.
Interesting.
Thank you, Almax. That was the place where everyone went dancing. Okay, sorry, go on.
I think that's something we should keep in mind if we ever go and dig deeper into a single genre. I think there usually is a defining author or defining book that kind of gives the kickstart to a genre. I mean, for fantasy does go back a lot further than people tend to assume, but I think Lord of the Rings is pretty foundational.
Mm-hmm. For epic fantasy.
Yes.
you know, something like, you know, Jules Verne was the archetypal adventure fantasy. I would recommend not writing in his style if you're going to write
anymore.
No. It's good to, you should be aware of it, though. Absolutely.
Definitely the adventure type. It doesn't necessarily have to be fantasy, but it is also science fiction. It's foundational for science fiction. I mean, the Journey to the Moon and whatever. I mean, that is quite fascinating. 2000 Leagues Under the Sea. That is definitely science fiction more than fantasy. But yes, you have the Kraken in there, so it's fantasy too. But yeah,
you absolutely have to look at what's big in your genre these days. If you are writing a thriller and you haven't read Gone Girl, stop what you're doing and go. Now, Gone Girl is a remarkably well-structured and extremely taut thriller, and it had the amazing power to make me want to stab every character to death by the end of it. But it's a really well put together book. Yeah. And if you think your stuff is that good, you better be familiar with it before coming out with yours.
And I readily admit I'm not reading Game of Thrones. I'm not that much into epic fantasy, and I have several reasons why I want to stay away from it.
Yeah.
I will eventually read sort of like plot summaries just to get the whole idea of it. I've been reading Olive McCaffrey, which is a mix of science fiction and fantasy. The Dragons of Pern start out as fantasy and they end up being more science fiction. I've read a lot of her stuff. I've read Mercedes Lackey. I've read what's her name? The whole Dagger series. I forgot the. I'm so bad with names.
Wait, tell me something about it.
A man and a woman reincarnate several times to solve their problems, and there's a mage who's living through all these incarnations because it was his fault that they got killed the first time around.
Oh.
And it's Unfulfilled Love, Dagger Spell, or you could call it the spell series. I'll have to dig through my wall, and I could tell it. Catherine.
Okay.
Catherine Kurtz, Catherine Kerr, Kerr. Yeah. And the Catherine Kurtz, the Camber series, that's very fundamental fantasy. The Camber of Culdee stories, Camber of Culdee. Setting is basically Wales, except it's not Wales, obviously, but about the struggle between humans who don't have magic and I forgot what her name is for the species or race that does have magic, and the humans overthrow the others and eliminate magic as much as they can, and it's an interesting set. It's again rather epic, at least 6 to 10 different books in it, and I've read all that, and I don't want to write that way. I think fantasy again has moved away from these very clear set enemies, good people, bad people, and moved into something a lot more. I don't know. I mean, it's like fantasy has exploded into so many subgenres. It's kind of
the last actually possibly the only book with dragons that I've read were Naomi Novik's dragon books, which are an interesting mashup of dragon books and Patrick O'Brian. And every single person who has read these books said, oh, she must be a huge Patrick O'Brian fan. Patrick O'Brian being someone who wrote military fiction based during the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh, that's an entire genre. You have dozens of authors.
I think he's like the author of
No, you get C.S. Forester goes back further.
Oh.
and you have
See,
the
I don't
Boiser.
know.
I know that genre. My husband used to be into it, so I read all that. So I read all these Napoleonic War naval fiction stuff. You have 4 or 5 really prolific authors in that, and they basically define the genre. And I don't. Patrick O'Brian is the most recent one. He's still writing that stuff. Most of the others have
No,
died.
he's not, because he died.
Oh,
Oh yeah, he died
but
about 10 years
there
ago, I
must be a
think.
couple who keep continuing that. But yeah,
Well, it's interesting though, because a lot of people say, I don't want to be confined by a genre. I want to mix and match all of these things. And it's like, that's great. But you
yes,
had better be able to describe your thing in terms specifically of which genres it is. Naomi Novik writes dragons, Patrick O'Brian dragons.
yeah,
And
that
people know
works.
immediately what that book is.
Yes.
If you say, well, there's a murder mystery, but there's magic, and it's set in the Regency era, and I'm going to have vampires, I got no idea what you're doing.
It could be steampunk, but you better have you better
That
have steam
first
engines.
word out of your mouth had better be steampunk.
You can have. You could probably have vampires in steampunk. I haven't seen that yet, but I think it's definitely possible to mix that into it. You can have magic in steampunk. You do not have to have magic in steampunk. You can do a lot of technology. You can
I thought
do
the whole
science
thing with
fiction.
steampunk was that it
Steampunk.
wasn't magic, that it was everything had been taken over by this proto technology. I mean, it was essentially magic, but it was this proto technology excuse for everything. I've only read Scott Westerfeld, so that's what I know about steampunk.
Lindsay Buroker does steampunk with the occasional bit of magic in it,
Okay.
which is kind of fun. I really like it because there's a tension between magic users and technology users.
So which one does she pick? If when she describes those books, how does she describe them?
She calls them steampunk.
Steampunk. Okay. Yeah, you're going to find there was a book, like I was describing this. I was so recently I took this weird turn and wrote some post-apocalyptic zombie books, a genre I have read very little in. I've basically read World War Z and another series. I haven't read in it. I don't know what all the conventions are of it. I have a lot more reading to do, or I need to run these by people who read it going, I don't know, what do you think? I'm sure that there are a whole bunch of conventions of the genre that I have missed because I'm not reading in it.
And it could turn out in your favor, but I would always suggest...
I have read this book so many times because all she did was come up with a basic zombie story,
Yes.
Which is what you're going to have if you think that you've invented the genre.
Yes.
You have to.
You're going back to the basics, and some people are tired out of the basics. So I will have to do some romance, erotica research reading, and we'll probably have to do some zombie story reading. And then we can see the patterns. And basically what you do is you take the patterns and you mold them a little to fix your story, but you don't twist them out of shape.
Yeah, if you have a romance novel where the main characters hate one another the entire time, you don't have a romance novel. I don't know what you have, but it's not a romance novel. And I don't care how much you're trying to reinvent the genre. Don't do it. Read a ton in the genres that you want to write. In the modern genres that you want to write. I mean, it's good to read Georgette Heyer, but there's a whole bunch of more recent people you need to read too.
Because the readers are used to that.
And readers are ahead of you. The readers are always ahead of you.
And I won't say there aren't readers who don't like a twist on the genre, but you better know what you're doing. I mean, you can write elven romance, which would have to follow the conventions of romance, and then you can make them elves or orcs or whatever. You can put the fantasy into the romance, but you better follow the romance conventions with it, and make it very clear that you're going to go Tolkien meets romance.
Yeah, absolutely.
You need to tell your readers what to expect.
And you need to be able to describe that book in terms of the audience that you're aiming for. You can't, when you're describing your book, you can't say, well, I want every person on the planet to read this. Are you interested in every book that's come out? Unlikely. You need to be able to describe that book in, if you're writing a Tolkien romance, are you more interested in picking up fantasy readers or romance readers who like fantasy? Those are two totally separate groups. Probably Absolutely. They overlap, but one is going to be primary when describing that book.
Yeah, and I'd say Tolkien romance is probably something difficult to write because true Tolkien fans want all this linguistic backdrop. They want all this ring war backdrop. So you may not want to go that way. Call it elven romance, and people will understand you.
Yeah. Yes.
So be clear. Even if you mix genres, and I think it's awesome. I love it when people mix a genre. But you need to know what you're doing, and it's awesome. Genre is like labels on food. Yes. And if you have a box labeled oranges, you better not have apples in there.
Yeah.
Because people will be angry.
And yes, absolutely. Okay, well, that was an interesting tour of the basics of genre. I guess we could probably do about 45 episodes on that.
Yeah.
It is important, and you have to learn it. And no, you are not too good for genre. You're not. There's even genres of literary fiction, guys. Yes. There's different types of literary fiction. Okay.
And genre writers work just as hard as literary authors.
Oh, heck yeah. All right, so that's it for this week's edition of the 21st Century Writer. If you're enjoying the podcast, please drop us a line or rate and review us on iTunes. For the 21st Century Writer, my name is Diane Patterson.
And I'm Hannah Steenbach.
And I hope you enjoyed this, and we will talk to you again next week. Bye.
Bye.